The bitter taste of betrayal. I've always believed that routines were the backbone of a stable marriage. For 28 years, Liza and I lived by that belief. Every morning was a comfortable choreography. I'd wake up at 5:30, brew my coffee in the kitchen, kiss my still drowsy wife goodbye, and head to the construction site where I've worked as a foreman since before our wedding anniversary hit double digits. Coffee has always been my anchor. Strong, no cream, no sugar, just black in my old metal thermos. I'd never understood the appeal of those fancy coffee shops with their complicated orders and overpriced drinks. Highway robbery, I'd called it, whenever I passed one with a line stretching out the door. Why pay $6 for something I could make for 30 cents at home? That's why it was so out of character when Ryan, my deputy foreman, finally convinced me to try this new coffee place on Maple Street. Best goddamn coffee in town, Mike, he insisted. Even an old-school guy like you would appreciate it. I brushed him off the first few times, but when Liza started leaving earlier for her accounting job, new client demands, she'd explained, I found myself with an extra 15 minutes in the morning. So I figured, why not? I never expected that a simple cup of coffee would be the thread that would unravel nearly 3 decades of marriage. But that's the thing about betrayal. It hides in the ordinary. It waits in mundane places like coffee shops and casual conversations. It sits in the passenger seat of your wife's car in the form of an extra cup of coffee that never makes it home. Maybe I should have noticed sooner. Maybe the signs were there in the subtle changes, Liza's new perfume, her suddenly busy schedule, the way her phone would mysteriously need charging right after she got home. But when you've been married as long as I have, you stop looking for reasons to be suspicious. You assume the best because you've built a life on that foundation of trust. Until a barista who didn't know any better shattered that foundation with a simple question about an order I'd never placed, about a routine I didn't know existed, about a second coffee that wasn't meant for me. I didn't plan on going to that coffee shop last Tuesday. It was raining, I was running late, and I'd already had my usual cup at home, but my thermos was leaking, and the thought of facing a morning meeting without caffeine made my head pound preemptively. So I pulled into the parking lot of the Daily Grind, even though I'd mentally scoffed at the hipster name 100 times before. Inside, the place was everything I expected: exposed brick, weird art, and 20-somethings with laptops and complicated hairstyles. The line moved faster than I anticipated, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of a kid with more tattoos than years under his belt. "What can I get you, sir?" he asked, already looking past me to the next customer. "Just a large black coffee," I said, reaching for my wallet. His eyes flicked back to me, narrowing slightly. "Name for the order?" "Mike. Mike ... He paused, then his face lit up with recognition. "Mike Wilson?" Something in his tone made me pause. Yeah. The kid, his name tag read Josh, broke into a friendly smile. "Oh man, your wife's one of our regulars. Liza, right? She's in here every morning, always super nice." He was already writing my name on a cup. "You want your usual too? One black coffee and one with caramel and an extra shot?" I felt a strange buzzing in my ears, like someone had suddenly turned on a white noise machine. I don't usually get coffee here," I managed, trying to keep my voice casual. Josh's smile faltered. "Oh, sorry, I just assumed. Since Mrs. Wilson always gets 2 coffees, one black, one fancy," he shrugged. "Figured one was yours." 2 coffees, every morning. "Right," I heard myself say through the buzzing. "No, just the one today." As I waited for my order, I tried to make sense of this new information. Liza didn't drink coffee at home. She'd always said it upset her stomach. And in 28 years of marriage, I'd never seen her bring home a coffee cup, not once. I took my coffee back to the truck and sat there, engine off, watching raindrops race down the windshield. 2 coffees, one black, one with caramel. When I thought about it, Liza had been leaving the house earlier for months now. "Traffic's getting worse," she'd said. "I need to beat the rush." I'd never questioned it. Why would I? I pulled out my phone and checked her location. The little blue dot showed she was at her office downtown, right where she was supposed to be. I zoomed in, studying the icon as if it might reveal something more than her approximate whereabouts. It didn't, of course. I was being ridiculous. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe she got coffee for her assistant Tanya. Maybe it was part of some office rotation thing. Maybe she had developed a taste for coffee and just never mentioned it. 28 years is a long time. People change, develop new habits. But why wouldn't she mention it? I ended up being 20 minutes late to the site meeting. Ryan raised an eyebrow as I slid into my seat, still clutching the unfamiliar paper cup. "The old man finally caved, huh?" he whispered, as the client droned on about timeline concerns. I forced a smile and nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. Throughout the meeting, I kept circling back to the same questions. 2 coffees every morning, never mentioned, never brought home. After work, I drove by the daily grind again. It was nearly closing time, and only a couple of customers remained. I parked across the street and watched people come and go for about 15 minutes, feeling like some pathetic private investigator in a bad movie. What was I even looking for? What did I expect to see? When I got home, Liza was making dinner, chicken parmesan, my favorite. She smiled when I walked in, came over and kissed me like she always did. Everything normal, everything familiar. "How was your day?" she asked, returning to the stove. "Fine," I lied. "Nothing unusual." That night, I couldn't sleep. Liza lay beside me, breathing evenly, completely unaware of the storm brewing in my mind. I stared at the ceiling, replaying our evening. Had anything been different? Had she seemed nervous or guilty? Number. She'd been the same Liza she'd always been, laughing at my jokes, telling me about her day, asking about the Henderson project. Around 3 a.m., I got up and went downstairs. Our house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. In the dim glow of the nightlight, I checked her purse, something I'd never done before. No receipts from the daily grind. Nothing suspicious at all. I opened her car next, using the spare key from the hook by the door. The interior was spotless, as always. No coffee cups, no evidence of morning rituals I wasn't part of. I checked the glove compartment, the center console, even looked under the seats. Nothing. Back inside, I pulled out my laptop and checked our joint credit card statement. There it was, a charge to the daily grind every weekday for the past 4 months. Always the same amount, $11.47, 2 coffees. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, feeling the weight of suspicion settle over me like a heavy blanket. What was I doing? Searching my wife's car in the middle of the night, going through her purse, checking credit card statements like some kind of obsessed lunatic. This wasn't me. This wasn't us. But the questions wouldn't stop. Why 2 coffees? Why every single morning? Why had she never mentioned it? And most importantly, who was drinking that second cup? By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to know. Not just for my peace of mind, but because whatever was happening, the not knowing was worse than any truth could be. I called Ryan and told him I'd be late. Then I parked my truck a block away from the daily grind and waited. I was about to become the pathetic private investigator for real. The morning air was crisp as I sat in my truck, sipping the terrible gas station coffee I'd bought as an excuse to be there. I'd positioned myself with a clear view of both the coffee shop entrance and the parking lot, but far enough away that Liza wouldn't spot my truck if she happened to look around. At 7:32, her silver Accord pulled into the lot. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched her get out. She looked good, she always did, wearing the blue blouse I'd given her for her birthday and dark slacks. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, catching the morning light. Liza walked into the daily grind with purpose, like someone who'd done this many times before. Through the large front windows, I could see her greet the tattooed barista, Josh, with a warm smile. They chatted briefly, obviously familiar with each other. She didn't even need to place an order. He just nodded and started making her drinks. Regular's privilege. While waiting, she checked her phone, smiling at something on the screen. Then she glanced at her watch, then toward the door, expectant, waiting for someone. My mouth went dry. I'd been hoping, praying, for an innocent explanation. Maybe she brought coffee to a coworker. Maybe she just liked having options. Maybe. At 7:41, a dark blue Honda CR-V pulled into the lot. I didn't recognize the vehicle. I didn't recognize the man who stepped out of it either. He was younger than me, maybe late 40s. Tall, with the kind of build that suggested regular gym visits, something I'd given up years ago. He wore a button-down shirt with no tie and pressed khakis. Dark hair with distinguished touches of gray at the temples. Looks that matched his apparent confidence as he strode toward the coffee shop door. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned white. Liza's face lit up when he entered. Josh handed her the 2 cups, and she immediately passed one to this stranger. Their fingers brushed during the exchange. It wasn't my imagination. They lingered. He said something that made her laugh, then placed his hand on the small of her back as they walked out together. The casual intimacy of the gesture hit me like a physical blow. They walked to his car, not hers. I watched as he opened the passenger door for her, a gesture I'd always done for Liza, until somewhere along the way it had faded into the comfortable casualness of long marriage. She got in, and he walked around to the driver's side. They sat there for a moment, talking, before he backed out and drove away. I followed them. Not too close. I'd watched enough crime shows to know the basics of tailing someone. They headed downtown toward the business district where Liza's accounting firm was located. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe this was innocent after all. A carpool arrangement, a colleague giving her a ride. Then they pulled into the parking garage beneath her office building, and I couldn't follow without being seen. I circled the block twice, then found street parking with a view of the garage exit. The blue Honda didn't emerge. I sat there for almost an hour, my coffee long cold, my mind racing through possibilities, each worse than the last. Eventually, I called Ryan and told him I had a family emergency. He didn't ask questions, one of the reasons we'd worked well together for 15 years. At 9:17, the Honda pulled out of the garage. The man was alone now. Liza had gone to work, just like she said she would. I returned to the construction site, going through the motions of my day in a fog. I nodded during meetings, signed off on materials, even cracked a joke with the electricians. But inside, I was unraveling. That evening, Liza came home at her usual time. She kicked off her shoes by the door, set her purse on the counter, and asked about my day, just like always. I watched her movements, looking for tells, for signs of the woman I'd seen that morning, the one who smiled differently at a stranger, who accepted his touch with such familiarity. "Mike, you okay?" she asked, catching me staring. "Yeah, just tired," I said. "Big day on site." She nodded sympathetically. "You've been working too hard. Why don't you take a day off soon? We could do something together." The irony of her suggestion made something twist painfully in my chest. I mumbled an agreement and excused myself to take a shower, needing a moment alone with the hot water to wash away the day's revelations. But some stains don't come clean so easily. The next 3 days were an exercise in acting. I'd never considered myself particularly talented in that department, but necessity proved a powerful teacher. I maintained our routines, kissed her goodbye in the mornings, asked about her day in the evenings, all while carrying the weight of what I knew and what I still needed to discover. Because I didn't know everything yet. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know how long this had been happening. I didn't know if it was just coffee and rides to work, or if it was everything else too. The uncertainty gnawed at me, making it hard to sleep, hard to eat, hard to focus on anything. Each morning I found an excuse to be near the daily grind. Each morning they repeated their routine: 2 coffees, a shared moment, a drive together. Always his hand on her back, always her smile, brighter than any she'd given me in recent memory. On Friday I decided I needed more concrete information. After they left, I went into the coffee shop and approached Josh. "Hey, remember me from Tuesday, Mike Wilson?" He nodded, recognition dawning. "Yeah, Liza's husband. Black coffee, right?" "That's me," I said, forcing a smile. "Quick question. That guy my wife meets here, is he a regular too?" Josh looked uncomfortable. "Doctor? Mercer?" "Yeah, he's been coming in about as long as your wife has." Dr. Mercer? A name? Something solid in the quicksand of speculation. "Thanks," I said. "I just realized I've heard Liza mention him, but I've never actually met the guy." "Oh." Josh relaxed. "Yeah, they're here like clockwork. Seems nice enough." I ordered a coffee I didn't want and left, Doctor. Mercer's name burning in my mind. Back in my truck, I pulled out my phone and searched. There were several Mercers in the area, but only one doctor, James Mercer, cardiologist at Memorial Hospital. The irony wasn't lost on me. A man who specialized in hearts was breaking mine. That night, I checked our phone records going back 6 months. There it was, dozens of calls and texts to a number I didn't recognize, starting about 4 months ago. Around the same time, the coffee shop charges began. But what hit me hardest wasn't the evidence of their communication. It was remembering that Liza had gone for a routine physical around that time. Had that been the beginning? Had she met him as a patient and become something else? I sat alone in our home office, surrounded by phone records and credit card statements, the paper trail of betrayal. Saturday morning, I told Liza I needed to check on a problem at the Henderson site, another lie to add to the growing collection between us. Instead, I drove to Memorial Hospital and parked in the visitor lot, my stomach churning with acid and adrenaline. The hospital directory listed Dr. James Mercer's cardiology practice on the 3rd floor. I took the elevator up, rehearsing what I might say, what I might do. The reality of confronting him hadn't fully formed in my mind. I was operating on autopilot, driven by a need to see, to know, to confirm. The waiting room was half full with mostly older patients. A young receptionist looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to see Dr. Mercer," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's important. Personal matter." She frowned. "Dr. Mercer is with patients all morning. You'll need to schedule—" "It's about his relationship with my wife," I interrupted, lowering my voice. "Liza Wilson." Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced toward the hallway behind her. Let me see if he can step out for a moment." She disappeared through a door, leaving me standing there, heart pounding in my ears. A minute later, a man emerged, the same man from the coffee shop. Dr. James Mercer in the flesh, wearing a crisp white coat with his name embroidered on the pocket, stethoscope around his neck. The professional costume of trustworthiness. "Mr. Wilson," he said quietly, extending his hand like we were meeting at a dinner party, "perhaps we should talk privately." I stared at his hand, but didn't take it. After an awkward moment, he withdrew it and gestured toward a small consultation room off the waiting area. I followed him inside. The room was sparse, 2 chairs, a small table, medical diagrams on the walls. He closed the door and turned to face me, his expression carefully composed. "I know about you and my wife," I said, before he could speak. "I've seen you together." He didn't deny it, didn't act surprised, just nodded slowly, his professional demeanor never cracking. I suspected this conversation would happen eventually. His calm acceptance fueled my anger. "How long?" I demanded. 4 months, he replied, meeting my gaze directly. Since her annual physical in February. 4 months. While I worked long hours to finish the Henderson project, while I fixed the leak in our roof, while I planned our summer vacation to the coast, they had been meeting for coffee, exchanging texts, building something secret behind my back. Do you love her? The question escaped before I could stop it. A flicker of something, pain, guilt, conviction, crossed his face. Yes, I do. His answer landed like a physical blow. 3 simple words that demolished 28 years of marriage. I struggled to keep my composure, to not lash out in the middle of his professional space. "And what exactly is your plan here, Doctor?" I asked, the title coming out like a curse. "Are you leaving your wife for mine, setting up house together, planning your happily ever after?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm divorced. Have been for 3 years. Of course he was. That made it all so much neater for them, didn't it? "I didn't seek this out," he continued, his voice low and measured. "Neither did Liza. It just happened." "Bullshit," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. "Affairs don't just happen. You make choices. Every day, every moment. You both chose this." He didn't argue, just stood there, taking my anger with that same infuriating composure. It made me want to grab him by his starched white coat and shake him until he showed some real emotion, until he understood what he had done to my life. "Has she told you she's leaving me?" I asked, dreading the answer. A hesitation. "We've discussed possibilities." "Possibilities," I repeated. The clinical detachment of the word made me want to laugh or maybe scream. "Well, here's a possibility for you, Doctor. You're destroying a marriage, a family, 28 years of history that you know nothing about." "I know more than you think," he said quietly. "Liza talks about your life together. She respects what you've built. But she's not happy, Mike. Hasn't been for a long time." His use of my name, the presumption of intimacy, ignited something dangerous inside me. "Don't you dare," I said, stepping closer to him. "Don't you dare tell me about my wife or my marriage." "I'm sorry," he said, and I hated that he sounded sincere. "Truly. This isn't how any of us wanted things to go." "Let me guess, she doesn't know I'm here." He shook his head. "No." "And you won't tell her?" "That's up to you," he said, "but I think this conversation should be between you and Liza." For once, we agreed on something. I moved toward the door, then stopped, turning back to face him one more time. "You know what the worst part is? It's not the betrayal. It's not even losing her. It's that both of you thought so little of me that you believed I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't care enough to figure it out." I left before he could respond, walking through the waiting room with my head high, past curious patients and the wide-eyed receptionist. It wasn't until I reached my truck that the trembling started, violent shudders that made it hard to put the key in the ignition. I didn't go home. Couldn't face the house where Liza was probably doing laundry or working on client files, unaware that her carefully constructed double life was crumbling. Instead, I drove to the construction site, found it empty on a Saturday, and sat in my truck staring at the half-finished building. Construction made sense to me. You started with a plan, followed the steps in order, and if you did everything right, you ended up with exactly what you expected. Life used to make that kind of sense, too. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Liza. "Everything okay? Thought you'd be home by now." I didn't answer. Couldn't trust myself to respond without giving everything away. I needed to confront her on my terms, not in a hasty text exchange. By evening, I'd received 3 more messages and 2 missed calls from her. The last text read, "Getting worried. Please call me." I finally replied, "Working late. Don't wait up." It was the first time in our marriage I'd deliberately shut her out, and even knowing what I knew, it felt wrong. But I needed time to think, to plan how to handle this conversation that would change everything. I stopped at a bar on the way home, nursed a single whiskey for nearly 2 hours, watching a baseball game I didn't care about on a TV above the counter. By the time I pulled into our driveway, it was past 11. The house was dark except for the porch light and a soft glow from our bedroom window. Liza was waiting up despite my message. I sat in the driveway, gathering my courage. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the receipt I'd gotten from the daily grind that morning. 2 coffees, $11.47. Proof of the small, ordinary betrayal that had led me to discover the larger one. Inside, I found Liza in bed, reading glasses on, book in hand. She looked up when I entered, relief washing over her face. "There you are." I was worried. "Were you?" I asked, hating the bitter edge in my voice. She frowned, setting her book aside. "Of course I was. You weren't answering, and you're never this late without calling." I pulled the coffee receipt from my pocket and placed it on the bed between us. Such a small thing to represent such a massive breach. She looked at it, confused at first. Then understanding dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by fear. The color drained from her face. "I met Dr. Mercer today," I said quietly. "James, your, what should I call him? Boyfriend? Lover? Future husband?" Liza's hand went to her mouth. Mike Dash. 4 months, I continued, my voice surprisingly steady. "That's what he told me. 4 months of coffee dates and text messages and God knows what else, while I believed everything was fine, while I trusted you completely." She seemed to shrink before my eyes, all pretense falling away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." "That's exactly what he said," I replied. "Funny how neither of you meant for it to happen, yet you both made dozens of deliberate choices to ensure that it did." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Then you've failed spectacularly," I said, and finally my voice broke. We talked until dawn, or rather, Liza talked, and I listened, to explanations, justifications, tearful apologies. How their innocent doctor-patient relationship had evolved during follow-up appointments, how she'd felt seen and appreciated in ways she hadn't in years, how loneliness can exist even within a marriage. "We grew apart," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of emotional conversation. "We stopped seeing each other, really seeing each other." "I saw you every day," I replied, exhaustion seeping into my bones. "But when was the last time you looked at me the way you did when we were young? When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about bills or home repairs or scheduling?" I wanted to argue, to list all the ways I'd shown my love over the years, the stability I'd provided, the home we'd built, the future we'd planned. But sitting there in the pale pre-dawn light, I realized there might be some truth to her words. Sometime during our nearly 3 decades together, we'd stop making an effort. We'd become comfortable, then complacent, then almost roommates who shared a bed. It didn't excuse what she'd done. Nothing could. But I understood it in a way I hadn't hours earlier. "What happens now?" I finally asked, as sunlight began to filter through the blinds. Liza looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring, the simple gold band I'd placed there 28 years ago. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to try to fix this, to see if we can find our way back to each other." "And the other part?" She met my eyes, and I saw both guilt and resolve there. "The other part can't imagine giving up what I've found with James." Her honesty hurt more than a lie would have. It confirmed that this wasn't just a fling or a midlife crisis. She had genuine feelings for him. "I need time," I said, rising from the edge of the bed where I'd spent the night. "I can't make any decisions right now." She nodded, understanding. "I'm going to stay at Ryan's for a few days," I continued. "I'll call you when I'm ready to talk more." "Okay," she whispered. Then, as I gathered a few essentials into an overnight bag, "Mike, I really am sorry. For all of it. Especially the lying." I paused at the bedroom door. "I know you are. That's what makes this so damn hard." Ryan didn't ask questions when I showed up at his door with a duffel bag and bloodshot eyes. He just handed me a beer, showed me to his spare room, and said, "Stay as long as you need, man." The days that followed passed in a fog. I went to work, supervised the crew, attended meetings, and signed paperwork. No one seemed to notice anything was wrong, or if they did, they had the decency not to mention it. At night, I'd return to Ryan's, eat whatever takeout we'd picked up, watch mindless TV, and try not to think about what was happening to my life. Liza called every day. I let most go to voicemail, but we talked briefly a few times. Surface-level conversations about bills that needed paying or mail that had arrived. We carefully avoided the elephant in the room, the decision that loomed over both of us. A week into my self-imposed exile, I drove by our house on the way to the site. James's blue Honda was in the driveway. Something cold and hard settled in my stomach at the sight. She hadn't wasted any time inviting him into our home. That evening, I called a lawyer. 2 days later, I met Liza at a neutral location, a park where we'd once brought our nieces and nephews to play. We sat on a bench watching children climb on the same equipment that had been there for decades. "I've spoken to an attorney," I told her, getting straight to the point. "I'm filing for divorce." She nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this. "I understand." "Do you?" I asked, not unkindly. "Because I'm not sure I do." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I think I destroyed something precious because I was too afraid to admit it was already damaged." She paused. "I should have talked to you, should have told you I was unhappy. That's my biggest regret." "Mine too," I admitted, "that we stopped talking, really talking." We sat in silence for a while, watching the children play, the weight of 28 years of shared history between us. "He makes you happy?" I finally asked. "Yes," she answered softly. "But that doesn't mean I don't care about you, that I don't love you in my way." "Your way just isn't enough anymore." "No," she agreed, "I don't think it is. For either of us." 3 weeks later, I moved back into our house. Liza had found an apartment closer to downtown, closer to the hospital, closer to him. She'd taken only what she needed, some clothes, personal items, a few pieces of furniture we'd agreed she could have. The rest, including the empty spaces where her things had been, remained. A visual reminder of what was missing. It was strange being alone in the house we'd shared for so long. The silence was both peaceful and oppressive. I found myself talking out loud sometimes just to hear a human voice. I rearranged furniture, painted the kitchen the color Liza had always vetoed, bought a new TV. Small changes to mark a new beginning. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly civil. We had no children to fight over, and after some negotiation through our lawyers, we reached a fair division of assets. 28 years, reduced to columns of numbers and legal terminology.